Throughout the history of mankind, thousands of people have witnessed inexplicable, eerie, and, according to their statements, paranormal supernatural events. There are places where such paranormal phenomena are recorded on an ongoing basis. And the most popular of them, perhaps, are haunted houses. In this video, Top F will tell you about one of the most famous haunted houses in the USA, which at the same time holds one of the most terrifying origin stories. And before we start, support my channel with your like, subscription, and turn on notifications to catch all the new releases. Get ready to be scared, we start. On April 10th, 1834, a terrible misfortune happened in New Orleans. The house of the respected gentleman Lalaurie caught fire. The socialite and her husband, the only dentist in the city, looked with horror at the flames. But when firefighters and police arrived at the house at 1140 Royal Street, the couple tried to detain them. Why? It turned out that they were afraid of exposing their terrible secret. Cursed Old House. New Orleans is the largest city in Louisiana. Its history is rich in events, and the city itself is full of various sites. And among them, there is one that stands out from the general list. We are talking about a house located in the View Care Quarter at 1140 Royal Street. Once upon a time, the stately mansion belonged to the wealthy and influential Lalaurie couple. Now, this house has a dubious reputation, as guides unanimously declare to tourists that ghosts live here and mystical phenomena occur. And, of course, hundreds of guests from New Orleans visit the mansion every year. Many people want to meet real ghosts and hear the chilling sounds of steel shackles. And if you don't have to worry about the flow of tourists, then the owners are in real trouble. The house has had several owners over the years. Among them was the Hollywood actor Nicolas Cage. In 2007, he bought this house for almost $3.5 million. But after a couple of years, he resold it. The new owners did not last long either. As a result, the mansion is still in the position of a nomad, now in one hand, then in another. They say all evil comes from a curse. After all, then, in the 30s of the 19th century, during a fire, people learned the horrifying truth about the bloody experiments of the Lalaurie spouses on black slaves. According to legend, the house was cursed. And the souls of the tortured slaves are still wandering around the upper floors of the accursed old house, groaning from unbearable pain and ringing with shackles. Madame Lalaurie. Delphine was born in 1775. She belonged to the wealthy and influential McCarthy family, who were known throughout Louisiana. Huge fortune immigrants from Ireland were able to put together thanks to the slave trade. Accordingly, all the children in the McCarthy family knew from childhood that black servants were not people. They were just things you could do with whatever you wanted. In 1800, Delphina married the influential Spanish officer Ramón de López. According to legend, the Queen of Spain herself blessed that marriage. But family happiness was short-lived. In 1804, on his way to Madrid, López made a stop in Havana and died suddenly there. Delphine was left alone with her little daughter. For years later, she married a second time. Her chosen one was the wealthy slave trader Jean Blanc. According to other sources, he was a banker and lawyer who belonged to the high society of the city. It seemed that Delphine had found her female happiness, having given birth to her husband's 4 children. Delphine's cousin became mayor of New Orleans in 1815. And the position in the society of the Blanche spouses became even stronger. But in 1816, Jean died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. For 9 years, Delphine rejected the offers of important gentlemen. But in the summer of 1825, she still gave in and agreed to become the wife of a young dentist, Leonardo Louis Lalaurie. Since there were no more dentists in New Orleans, Lalaurie was more than a wealthy person and a friend of all dignitaries. Soon Leonardo bought a luxurious house at 1140 Royal Street. All repairs were personally supervised by Madame Lalaurie. And she ordered furniture and interior details from the most famous and expensive masters so that her mansion would correspond to the fashion of that time. By the way, all the work was carried out by black slaves. And even then the neighbors began to notice that Madame treated them cruelly. But no one wanted to get involved with the elite of society. One day an incident occurred that nevertheless leaked through the high walls of the Lalaurie Mansion. Once, neighbors heard screams coming from the site of a socialite. Of course, curiosity took over. Looking out the windows, a picture appeared before them that was unpleasant even for the slave-owning South. Delphine, along with several servants, was running after a black girl with a whip. From fragments of high-profile phrases, it became clear that the young maid strongly pulled the hostess's hair while combing. In the end, the girl was cornered. And in order not to fall into the hands of an angry hostess, she jumped out onto the balcony and then jumped off the third floor. But the servant was not so lucky. She, having received many fractures, remained alive. To the surprise of the neighbors, Delphine did not call the doctor. And a few days later the girl died. After that, they simply buried her in the yard. Then the neighbors did not know that the maid dared to commit suicide for only one reason: she was afraid to be in the attic of the Lalaurie Mansion because no one returned alive from there. Usually the guilty slaves who had been there, after a few days, were found in a mutilated form in a utility room in the yard by the rest of the slaves. And from there they disappeared forever. Slaves, of course, were afraid of something to anger their mistress. After all, this meant one thing: death and terrible agony. Therefore, the girl jumped off the balcony. To the surprise of Madame Lalaurie herself, the neighbors, who witnessed the slave's suicide, ventured to report to the police. Law enforcement officers, in turn, not afraid of the wrath of powerful patrons, took up the investigation of the crime. By the way, the writer Harriet Martineau, who had been in the Lalaurie house a few years before this event, noted that Delphine was very nice and kind to her servants in public. They just looked extremely exhausted and unhappy. When asked by the writer about this state of the servants, the socialite laughed it off and quickly changed the topic of conversation. But, despite this, a local lawyer still visited Delphine to remind her of the rules for keeping slaves. After the death of the girl, the investigation decided to confiscate all 9 slaves from the socialite. After that, they were put up at the city auction. But unfortunately for the slaves, Lalaurie persuaded her friends and relatives to buy them and then give them to her. So they still failed to avoid the sad fate. In addition, Delphine was ordered to pay a fine of $500. At the time, it was a substantial sum. But given her condition, she easily dealt with this trouble. Room of the Fear. On the night of April 10, 1834, the Lalaurie Mansion suddenly caught fire. The firemen arrived quickly. Having coped with the fire, they decided to inspect the house from the inside, but the owners suddenly opposed this. Leonardo Lalaurie rudely answered the questions of the firefighters. Some people would be better off staying at home rather than coming to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle in other people's affairs. But still, they could not keep the firefighters and the arriving policemen. Once inside the mansion, they found several black slaves chained to the floor and walls. It turned out that the fire, at her peril and risk, was organized by the cook, also chained only to the stove. She set fire to the curtains to draw the attention of law enforcement officers to the horrors taking place in Lalaurie's house. But the worst was waiting for the police upstairs, in the attic. It turned out that there was a laboratory where Madame Lalaurie conducted medical experiments on slaves. Law enforcement officers discovered a man whom a socialite was trying to turn into a woman. A mutilated girl lived in an iron cage measuring 60 by 60 centimeters. Her limbs were broken so that the unfortunate person resembled a crab in appearance. She moved, by the way, accordingly. Another slave was missing limbs, and her entire body was covered in thin scars. Delphine tried to make a caterpillar out of it. In the corner, the police found a man chained to the wall with a stick in his head. With her help, Delphine was going to stir his brains. Someone from the crowd of people who entered the house, along with policemen and firefighters, suddenly remembered that Madame Lalaurie mocked her daughters as well. terrible rumors began to be told to law enforcement officers. For example, they were afraid that because of the hobby mothers would not get married. After all, stories about Lalaurie's attic could reach potential suitors. And then the daughters decided to poison their mother. But their plan failed. In retaliation, Delphine kept the girls locked up for a year, periodically forcing them to eat waste. The poor people from the neighboring quarter also told about Madame Lalaurie's addiction to rejuvenation masks made from the blood of black children. It all started with the fact that once on the face of Delphine while preparing dinner, chicken blood splashed. The woman decided that she had a good effect on the skin, and I decided to make masks regularly. But for unknown reasons, Lalaurie replaced the birds with people. How many children died, no one knew. But they said that Delphine found out about her husband's betrayal with a black slave, and after that, she began to take revenge. She did not spare the child Leonardo either. His blood also went to the preparation of a miraculous mask. And Lalaurie's mistress, having learned about the death of the child, committed suicide. They also talked about the fact that a minotaur lives in the attic, a slave who became the lover of one of the daughters of a secular lioness. Upon learning of this, she ordered the man to put on the head of a bull and chain him to the wall. However, the police did not find the minotaur. A couple of days later, New Orleans looked like a beehive. Black slaves, and with them, free citizens decided to commit lynching against a family of sadists. But the matter did not reach the lynch court. The police managed to disperse the crowd and did not let them near the house. Therefore, what exactly the police found in Lalaurie's house is a mystery. The day after the fire, newspapers tried to outdo each other with loud headlines and information taken from unverified sources. The main thing is to create excitement. Many historians believe that, in fact, the locals, and with their filing, the newspapers have greatly exaggerated. Yes, Madame Lalaurie behaved terribly with the servants, but there were no experiments and bloody masks. There is evidence that law enforcement officers took out 7 emaciated slaves from the house with whip marks on their bodies. One woman had a large but not fatal wound on her head. But 2 facts still make us think that the find of the police was more terrible. Firstly, the slaves were sent to prison, opening access to them for everyone. And in just a few days their number exceeded 4,000. It is unlikely that the people went only to look at the thin slaves. Secondly, the flight of dolphins. Given her fortune and connections, she again could get away with a fine and confiscation of slaves. And no more. We must not forget that in those days New Orleans was considered the center of the slave-owning South. Yes, some laws were indeed on the side of the slaves, but they have easily circumvented thanks to patrons and money. Nor could she be afraid of the lynching. The police chief and the military would have protected her. This means that Delphine's hands were indeed stained with the blood of the unfortunate slaves. And she, realizing the gravity of the crimes, decided to run away to the spouses on the carriage, along with the money, managed to escape from the crowd and rush off. But then the versions differ. So, some researchers believe that Delphine and Leonardo changed their names and stayed in their native Louisiana. Another, more plausible and supported by circumstantial evidence, says that Delphine, husband, by the way, disappears, managed to get to the port. There she boarded a ship bound for Alabama. And from there the woman managed to move to France. This version is indirectly confirmed by a find made during the transfer of the St. Louis cemetery. Then the workers found a tombstone with the inscription, Marie Delphine Lalaurie, 1775 to 1842 inch. Also at one time, there was a widespread version that Delphine died a few years later while hunting. Allegedly, a wounded boar killed her. There is another version. It says that Madame Lalaurie died in Paris in 1849. And the more time passed from the moment of the fire, the more the Lalaurie family became overgrown with rumors. At the end of the 19th century, when interest in Delphine arose again, her story began to be replenished with new stories. And more terrible and bloody. They began to tell that she had many methods for torture, which she invented. The new owners of the house were reminded of the atrocities of dolphins. According to legend, when they were rebuilding the house, the remains of 12 people chained to various torture devices were found in the basement. And after that, all sorts of devilry allegedly began to happen in the mansion. Either the owners saw at night the ghost of a mutilated black man, then Madame Lalaurie herself appeared. And sometimes, at night, blood-curdling screams are heard in the house. All this, of course, was used by people who make money, as they say, out of thin air. They, along with the owners, invited all kinds of paranormal experts to study the mansion. And although studies have not yielded results, today the home of the Lalaurie couple is one of the most famous and haunted houses. The story of Delphine Lalaurie formed the plot of one of the episodes of the 3rd season of the American Horror Story series. That's all for today, my dear friends. Mr. Top F was with you. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Also, write down in the comments what topic of the video you want to see in the next release of Top F. Bye.